My girlfriend told me she loved me more than anything in this world, that I was her home, her forever person, the one she'd grow old with. And then she left me 3 months after I was diagnosed with stage 3 lymphoma. I'm not here for sympathy, and I'm not here to paint her as a villain, because honestly, that would be too easy. What I want to know is whether I'm wrong for what I did years later when she came back, when I had survived, when suddenly I was worth loving again. But let me start from the beginning, because context matters, and you need to understand who we were before everything fell apart. I met Iris when I was 24, fresh into my role as a growth strategist for a tech startup in Seattle. She was 23, working in social media marketing, and we met at one of those networking events that nobody actually wants to attend, but everyone goes to anyway. She had this energy about her, like she was always performing for an invisible audience, always thinking about how the moment would look in a story later. I was the opposite. I was the guy with the spreadsheets, the projections, the quiet confidence that came from actually building things instead of just talking about them. We clicked immediately, or at least I thought we did. She took a photo of us that first night and posted it with some caption about unexpected connections, and I remember thinking it was a bit much, but also kind of charming. Within 3 months, we were living together in my apartment in Capitol Hill, and within 6 months, she was talking about marriage, kids, the whole package. Looking back now, I realized we were speaking two completely different languages. When Iris talked about our future, she was talking about aesthetics, about the version of us that looked good, that fit a narrative. When I talked about our future, I was talking about retirement accounts, about whose career would take priority when, about what we'd do if one of us got sick. I actually brought that up once, the getting sick part, and she laughed and said we were too young to think about stuff like that. I didn't push it. I was 25 and healthy and stupid enough to think that planning for disaster was the same as preventing it. The diagnosis came on a regular afternoon in October. I'd been feeling tired for weeks, losing weight without trying, and I had this persistent cough that wouldn't go away. My doctor ordered some tests, then more tests, and then suddenly I was sitting in an oncology office being told I had non-Hodgkin lymphoma and that we needed to start treatment immediately. The doctor used words like aggressive and stage 3 and chemotherapy, and I just sat there nodding like I understood, but really I was thinking about Iris, about how I was going to tell her, about how this was going to change everything. I called her from the parking lot, and she came to meet me right away, and when I told her, she cried harder than I did. She held my face and said, "We're going to fight this together. I promise, I'm not going anywhere." And I believed her completely. The first few weeks, she was incredible. She came to every appointment, took notes when I was too overwhelmed to focus, researched diets and supplements and alternative treatments. She posted about it too, not in a gross way exactly, but in that performative support way where she'd share articles about cancer survival rates with captions about staying strong. Her friends would comment with heart emojis and prayers, and she'd respond to every single one. I didn't love it, the public nature of my illness, but I told myself she was processing it her own way, that she needed the support system. What I didn't realize then was that she was building a narrative where she was the devoted girlfriend standing by her sick boyfriend, and narratives like that only work if there's an audience watching. The chemotherapy started in November, and it was exactly as horrible as everyone says it is. The nausea, the exhaustion, the way food tasted like metal, watching my hair fall out in clumps in the shower. But worse than all of that was watching Iris slowly disappear. Not physically at first. She still came to the hospital, still sat in the chair next to my bed, but mentally she was somewhere else. She'd scroll through her phone while I was getting infusions, and when I tried to talk to her about how scared I was, she'd say, "I know, baby, me too," but in this distant way, like she was reading lines from a script. The posts about my illness stopped around week 3 of treatment. When I asked her about it, she said, "I just need some privacy right now. This is really hard for me." And I didn't know how to tell her that it was harder for me without sounding selfish. By December, she was coming to maybe half of my appointments. She always had a reason. Work was busy. She wasn't feeling well. She needed to take care of her mental health. That last one bothered me the most because what was I supposed to say to that? That her mental health was less important than my literal cancer? I wasn't that person, so I just said I understood and tried not to think about how I was facing the scariest thing in my life essentially alone. My parents lived across the country and couldn't come out more than once a month. My brother was deployed overseas, so it was supposed to be Iris and me against this thing. Except increasingly, it was just me. The breaking point came in early January at a coffee shop near my apartment. I just finished my worst round of chemo yet. I could barely keep water down, and Iris had asked to meet me to talk. I knew what was coming before she said anything. I could see it in the way she wouldn't look at me directly, in the way she was already crying before the conversation started. She said, "I can't do this anymore. Dan, I just can't." And I asked her what she meant, even though I knew. She said she wasn't ready to be a caregiver, that she was too young to spend her life in hospitals, that she deserved to actually live instead of watching someone die. That last part was what got me, the casual certainty that I was dying, like it was already decided. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just sat there and let her say everything she needed to say. I think she wanted me to fight for us, to beg her to stay, because when I didn't, she looked almost offended. She said, "Say something." And I said, "I hope you find what you're looking for." And that was it. She blocked my number that night, blocked me on every social media platform, blocked my family when my mom tried to reach out to her. It was like I had died already and she was just moving on with her life. I found out later through a mutual friend that she'd posted something about choosing herself and setting boundaries and healing from toxic relationships, and people were supporting her like she was the victim in all of this. I was alone in my apartment, bald and nauseous and genuinely unsure if I'd survive the next 6 months, and she was getting praised for her bravery in leaving. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here's what I realized during those months after she left, when I was at my absolute lowest and there was nobody there to witness it. Iris didn't leave because I was sick. She left because I became a risk. As long as I was healthy and successful and building a good life, I was worth the investment. The moment I became uncertain, the moment loving me required actual sacrifice instead of just Instagram captions, I stopped being worth it. She wasn't a monster. She was just someone who loved the idea of me more than she loved the reality of me. And when those two things stopped matching up, she chose herself. Part of me doesn't even blame her for that. But here's the thing nobody tells you about rock bottom. It's actually pretty stable. Once you're there, once you've lost everything you thought mattered, you stop living for other people's approval and you start living because you're still breathing and you might as well do something with that. I was lying in a hospital bed in February, alone except for the nurses and doctors, and I made a decision. If I was going to die, I was going to die building something that mattered. And if I was going to live, I was going to live for someone who chose me without guarantees. The doctors gave me a 30% chance of survival, and I spent the first month after Iris left wondering if I even wanted to beat those odds. That's the part nobody talks about with cancer. It's not just your body fighting. It's your mind deciding whether the fight is worth it. And when you're alone at 3 in the morning throwing up bile into a hospital toilet, the answer isn't always obvious. But somewhere around late February, something shifted. I was lying in my hospital bed after a particularly brutal chemo session, and I opened my laptop and looked at the business plan I'd been working on before the diagnosis, this growth strategy framework I developed for scaling startups in competitive markets. I'd shown it to Iris once, and she'd said it was cool, but asked when it would make real money. And I'd shelved it because I was busy and it felt like a side project. Now I had nothing but time, and I figured if I was going to die anyway, I might as well die working on something that mattered to me. I started rebuilding the framework from my hospital bed, reaching out to former clients via email, offering consulting sessions for cheap just to keep my mind occupied. The work was slow because some days I couldn't get out of bed. Some days the brain fog from treatment was so bad I couldn't form coherent sentences, but I kept at it. My doctor said keeping busy might actually help, that patients with purpose tend to respond better to treatment, and I didn't know if that was real science or just something he told dying people to keep them motivated, but I didn't care. By March I had 3 clients, by April I had 7, and by May I realized I was building something that could actually scale. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was planning a future I might not live to see. But that's what hope looks like when you're dying. It's working anyway. That's when I met Paige. She was one of the oncology nurses on my floor, late 20s, and she had this completely no-nonsense attitude that I appreciated after months of people tiptoeing around me like I was already a corpse. She didn't do the sad voice thing, didn't treat me like I was fragile. She just came in and did her job and occasionally told me to stop being dramatic when I complained about the nausea. The first real conversation we had was in June when she caught me working on my laptop at 2 in the morning and asked what I was doing awake. I told her I'd rest when I was dead, and she made some comment about how at this rate that would be sooner than I thought, and I actually laughed for the first time in months. She sat down and asked what I was working on, and I explained the whole framework, expecting her to get bored or give me some platitude about staying positive. But instead she asked really specific questions about market positioning and customer acquisition that showed she was actually listening. After that, she'd stop by during her breaks and we'd talk. Not about cancer, Not about my chances, just normal stuff. She told me about her nightmare roommate who kept adopting cats without asking, about her family in Portland, about how she'd wanted to be a pediatric nurse but couldn't handle seeing sick kids, so she chose oncology instead because at least adults understood what was happening to them. I told her about my work, about Seattle, about everything except Iris, because what was there to say? That conversation became routine. Whenever Paige was on shift, she'd find 20 minutes to just sit and be normal with me, and I started looking forward to it more than I wanted to admit. She never asked about my personal life, never pushed, and there was something incredibly freeing about being around someone who only knew sick me, who didn't have the before version to compare me to. The remission news came in August, almost 10 months after my diagnosis. My oncologist said the tumors had shrunk significantly, that the treatment was working better than expected, that I need to continue monitoring, but I was officially in remission. I called my parents first, and they cried. I called my brother, and he said he'd visit as soon as his leave came through, and then I just sat in my apartment alone trying to process that I was actually going to live. Paige stopped by later that evening. She wasn't even on shift, but she'd heard the news. And she brought Thai food and made some joke about how I couldn't use the death excuse to get out of things anymore. We ate on my couch and didn't talk about the fact that I'd survived. We just existed in that moment. And I remember thinking this was what contentment felt like, not excitement or relief, just quiet gratitude for being alive and having someone who cared without needing anything from me. My business took off after that. Turns out having a near-death experience makes you really good at prioritizing what matters in business strategy, and clients started seeking me out specifically because of my approach. The growth happened faster than I expected. By November, I'd hired 2 contractors. By January of the following year, I'd moved into a small office space in downtown Seattle, and by March, I was making more money than I'd ever made at my old startup job. I wasn't rich by any stretch, but I was stable, successful, building something real. Paige and I had started seeing each other outside the hospital somewhere around October. Nothing official, just coffee or dinner when her shifts allowed, and it felt easy in a way relationships never had before. She never asked about my future plans with her, never pushed for labels or timelines. She just showed up and let things develop naturally. I told her once that I appreciated how low pressure everything felt with her, and she said something about how she'd seen me when I thought I was dying, so everything after that was just bonus. That hit me harder than it should have. The casual way she acknowledged that she'd chosen me when there was no guarantee of a future, when loving me was actually a risk. That's when Iris came back into my life. It was April, over 2 years since she'd left, and I got a message request on LinkedIn from her. She'd unblocked me apparently, and the message said she'd heard I was doing well, and she was so happy for me, that she'd always known I was strong enough to beat it. The exclamation point bothered me more than it should have. She followed up an hour later saying she knew it had been a long time, but she'd really love to reconnect, that she'd done a lot of growing, and thought I'd be proud of the person she'd become. I stared at those messages for a long time trying to figure out what I felt, and the answer was nothing. Just a mild curiosity about what could possibly make her think I'd want to hear from her now. I didn't respond immediately, but she kept trying. Messages about how she'd been following my company's growth, how she'd always believed in my potential, how she'd thought about me often over the past 2 years. That last one made me angry in a way the rest didn't. Because if she'd thought about me so often, she could have unblocked me at any point during the months when I actually needed someone. She could have checked in when I was bald and vomiting and uncertain, but she only came back when checking in was safe, when I was successful again, when loving me was convenient. I showed the messages to Paige one night, and she read them without saying anything, then handed my phone back and asked what I wanted to do. Not what should I do, not her opinion, just what did I want. I said I didn't know yet, and she told me to figure it out, but not to let Iris make me forget who was actually there when it mattered, then went back to reading her book like we'd been discussing what to order for dinner. Iris eventually asked to meet in person, said she wanted closure or to explain herself or something, and against my better judgment I agreed. We met at the same coffee shop where she'd broken up with me, and when she walked in, I barely recognized her. She looked the same physically, but there was this desperate energy about her that hadn't been there before, like she was trying too hard to seem casual. She ordered some complicated drink and sat down and immediately started talking about how mature she was now, how she'd been in therapy, how she understood that she'd handled things badly, but she'd been young and scared. She talked for almost 20 minutes about her journey of self-discovery, about the work she'd done on herself, about how she'd realized what really mattered in life. Then she said, "If I'd known you were going to survive, that things would turn out okay." maybe I would have made different choices. And that sentence told me everything I needed to know. She hadn't come back because she'd realized she loved me. She'd come back because I'd become a safe bet again, because the risk had passed, and suddenly I was worth the investment again. I let her keep talking, let her explain and justify and rationalize. And when she finally stopped and looked at me expectantly, I realized she thought this was working, that I was going to take her back. She reached across the table for my hand and said, "I never stopped caring about you, Dan. I just needed time to become someone strong enough to handle hard things." And I pulled my hand back and said, "You needed time, or you needed me to stop being a hard thing?" She didn't have an answer for that. I stood up and told her I appreciated her honesty, but I'd moved on, and she actually looked shocked, like it hadn't occurred to her that I might not want her back. As I walked out, I heard her ask if there was someone else, and I didn't answer because it wasn't about Paige. It was about the fact that Iris had shown me exactly who she was when things got difficult, and I decided to believe her. I called Paige from my car and told her about the meeting. She asked how I felt, and I said I felt free, like I'd finally closed a chapter one didn't even realize was still open. She told me she'd just adopted another cat and her roommate was going to kill her, so she might need a place to crash, and I laughed and told her to come over. That night, sitting on my couch with Paige and her newest rescue cat, I realized this was what I'd survived for, not the success or the money or the vindication, but the quiet, simple joy of being chosen by someone who'd seen me at my worst and stayed anyway. Paige moved in 3 weeks after that coffee shop meeting with Iris, not because of some grand romantic gesture, but because her roommate actually did kick her out over the cat situation and my apartment was bigger anyway. It felt natural, the way good things do when they're not forced. And I remember thinking how different this was from living with Iris, how there was no performance to it, no checking in with each other before posting photos, no narrative we were trying to sell to the world. Paige just existed in my space like she'd always been there, leaving her nursing scrubs on the bathroom floor and stealing my coffee in the mornings, and it was mundane and perfect in a way I hadn't known relationships could be. Iris didn't stop trying after that first meeting. She started texting from a new number I didn't have blocked, always late at night, always when she was probably drinking and feeling nostalgic for a version of us that never actually existed. The messages were long and rambling about how she'd made a mistake, how she'd been too immature to handle the situation properly, how if I'd just give her another chance she could prove she was different now. She sent articles about forgiveness and second chances, quoted some podcast about how people deserve grace for their worst moments, told me she'd been seeing a therapist who helped her understand that she'd been dealing with her own trauma when she left. I didn't respond to any of it, but I didn't block the number either, because part of me needed to see how far she'd go, needed confirmation that my read of the situation was correct. The messages escalated over the next few weeks. She started showing up places she thought I might be, the coffee shop near my office, the gym I'd rejoined after getting cleared by my doctor, even the Thai restaurant where Paige and I got takeout sometimes. It never felt threatening exactly, more pathetic than anything, like she was trying to manufacture a chance encounter that would make me realize what I was missing. Once she actually waited outside my office building and tried to talk to me as I was leaving. She started going on about how she'd been doing a lot of thinking about us, about our history, about everything we'd built together before things went wrong. I told her we hadn't built anything together, that she'd been an observer to my life, not a participant, and she looked at me like I'd slapped her. She said something about how she'd loved me, and I told her she'd loved the version of me that was convenient for her. Then I walked away before she could respond. Paige noticed I was distracted, asked if everything was okay, and I showed her the messages. She read through them with this increasingly annoyed expression and finally asked if I wanted her to talk to Iris. Said sometimes it takes hearing it from another woman for the message to sink in. That maybe if Iris understood I'd actually moved on, she'd stop living in this fantasy where we were going to get back together. I told her I didn't want her involved in my mess, and she said my mess was her mess now, and that was kind of how relationships worked, so I gave her Iris's number and honestly didn't think much would come of it. Paige called Iris the next day while I was at work. I don't know exactly what was said because Paige refused to give me details, just said she'd handled it with this satisfied expression that made me nervous and a little proud at the same time. But whatever she said worked, because the messages from Iris stopped completely. For about 3 days. Then I got one final text, longer than all the others combined. This whole thing about how she couldn't believe I'd chosen someone who didn't know the real me, who hadn't been there for the good times, who was essentially a stranger compared to our shared history. She said, she only knows sick you, broken you. She doesn't know who you were before all this. and I realized that was exactly the point. Paige knew me without the mythology, without the comparison to who I used to be or who I might become. She'd met me at my absolute worst and decided I was enough exactly as I was. And that was worth more than any shared history or nostalgia for better times. I wrote back, my first response in weeks, and said, "You're right. She doesn't know who I was before, but unlike you, she didn't need that version of me to decide I was worth staying for." I blocked the number after sending it and felt absolutely nothing. No guilt, no sadness, just relief that this chapter was finally actually closed. The final confrontation came in June, almost 3 months after that first coffee shop meeting. Paige and I were at a networking event for my company, and Iris showed up. I still don't know how she found out about it. Maybe she'd been following my company's social media, or maybe she heard through mutual connections we still had in Seattle's tech scene. But she walked in wearing this dress that was clearly expensive and clearly chosen to remind me of what I was missing. She didn't approach me immediately, just sort of hovered near the bar watching me, and I could feel Paige tense up next to me when she realized who it was. Iris finally came over when Paige went to the bathroom, and she had this weird smile on her face like we were old friends running into each other unexpectedly. She said she'd seen my company was doing well, that she wasn't surprised because she'd always known I had potential. I didn't say anything, just waited for her to get to the point, and she started talking about how she'd made a mistake and thought I knew that, implied that was why I couldn't fully move on. I told her I had fully moved on, that I was happy, and she actually laughed like I'd said something funny. She said, "You're settling for someone who saw you at your weakest. Don't you see how that's just fear? You're afraid of being with someone who expects you to be great." And that's when I realized she genuinely believed this, that in her mind, she was the victim here, that I was making a mistake by choosing stability over whatever chaotic energy she thought passed for passion. Paige came back before I could respond, and she looked at Iris for a long moment before introducing herself in this bright, cheerful voice that somehow made everything more uncomfortable. She said how she'd heard so much about Iris, how it must be difficult seeing me doing well without her, how she hoped Iris found whatever it was she was looking for. There was nothing overtly mean about what Paige said, but the subtext was clear, and Iris just stood there looking between us before saying something about how we didn't know what she and I had together, then walking away. We watched her leave, and Paige turned to me and asked if she'd overstepped, and I kissed her right there in the middle of my networking event in front of everyone. That was the last time I saw Iris. I heard through friends that she moved to San Francisco a few months later, something about a new job and wanting a fresh start, and I hoped she found whatever she was looking for, genuinely. Not because I forgave her or because I thought we could ever be friends, but because holding on to anger would mean she still mattered, and she didn't. What mattered was the woman who'd chosen me without guarantees, who'd seen me at my worst and decided to stay, who didn't need me to be successful or healthy or impressive to think I was worth her time. 2 years later, I'm cancer-free and my company is thriving in Paige, and I got engaged last month. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if Iris had stayed, if she'd been strong enough to handle the hard parts, and I realize we still would have ended eventually because we were fundamentally incompatible. She needed someone who looked good in her story, and I needed someone who'd stay when the story got ugly. People ask me sometimes if I feel bad about not giving Iris another chance, if I think I was too harsh or unforgiving. The answer is no, and here's why. Forgiveness doesn't mean reopening doors that closed for good reasons. Iris showed me exactly who she was when life got difficult, when loving me required actual sacrifice instead of just Instagram captions and coffee dates. She made her choice, and I respected it enough not to pretend it didn't happen just because circumstances changed. I survived cancer, built a successful business, and found someone who chose me without needing proof I'd be worth the investment. Iris wanted back in when the risk was gone, when I was safe again, and that's not love. That's just opportunism dressed up in therapy language and second-chance rhetoric. So am I the asshole for not taking back my ex-girlfriend who left me when I was dying but wanted back when I survived and became successful? Maybe some people think so. Maybe they believe everyone deserves forgiveness and second chances and that holding on to the past is petty. But I'm not holding on to the past. I'm protecting my future. The woman I'm building that future with earned it by showing up when there were no guarantees, and I'm not going to disrespect that by entertaining someone who only showed up when the outcome was certain. Some doors close for good reasons, and you dishonor both yourself and the person who stayed by opening them again. What do you think about this story? Let me know in the comments, drop a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories.